Hello and welcome to this briefing from Manchester Communication Research School on the new Schools Guide to Implementation published by the EEF. My name is Susie Fraser, I'm Director of Manchester Communication Research School, and I will just guide you through some of the main headlines and updates in the new guidance. So what we'll do through this recording is introduce the key ideas in the new guidance report, be clear on what has changed and what hasn't changed, and it's important to say at this point that this isn't brand new, and there are some updates and a kind of deeper understanding on some of the insights, but hopefully this will be familiar to many of you and will just be seen as an evolution of the existing guidance. There'll be an opportunity to interact with some of the new concepts that are introduced in the guidance report, and this is just scratching the surface. This the guidance obviously will need quite a lot of digesting and consideration, but this is just an introduction. So to start with, an introduction from Professor Becky Francis, who is the Chief Executive at the Education Endowment Foundation. I'll give you a moment to read that. So we'll all be familiar with this culture shift that is occurring in schools towards a more widespread engagement with research and evidence-based resources. And evidence now has become our kind of go-to source for guidance. We know that our education system is one of the most research engaged in the world. However, this awareness on its own does not necessarily result in improved outcomes, and implementation is critical for turning interest and engagement with research into tangible changes in school practice that will eventually lead to improved pupil outcomes. So we know implementation matters, and as evidence use becomes woven into the system, we face a choice about where we go next, whether we collectively want to turn the widespread awareness of research into meaningful changes in practice. And for this, implementation is key. So for those of you that are familiar with the current guidance report, you'll recognise the images on the screen now. This was launched in 2018 and since then has become one of the most popular resources that have been downloaded from the website. Shining that light on implementation has helped schools think about change in a more structured way. This has emphasised the importance of exploring and preparing and has provided that common language around implementation. The current guidance report recommends certain implementation strategies in each phase. So, for example, writing implementation plans, monitoring implementation. But we know that these strategies can be done well or badly, and that can significantly influence their impact. So, for example, an implementation leader writing and using an implementation plan in isolation is unlikely to improve implementation. So you can hit the mark with implementation, but really miss the point. We can go through a process, but not really do implementation well. So the quality of implementation matters. The new guidance report is based on an extensive review of evidence and implementation in schools, and it's the largest ever conducted on this topic. Encouragingly, and hope probably no surprise, it shows that implementation matters. When implemented well, the effectiveness of school-based programmes does increase in terms of pupil outcomes. The key phrase here, though, is when implemented well. The new guidance focuses on what enables effective implementation in school. If the takeaway message in the first version was treat implementation as a process, now we're focusing on how to do that process well. And we're introducing a conversation around quality. One of the main messages to emerge from this new guidance is the importance of people, and people drive effective implementation. The evidence shows that implementation is mostly a collaborative and social process, driven by how people think, behave, and interact. So implementing change in a school involves coordinating the actions of hundreds of people, each with their own habits, beliefs, knowledge, skills. It can be tricky. Let's dig into the recommendations then. So recommendation 1 is around the behaviours that drive effective implementation. The review and guidance identifies 3 cross-cutting behaviours that drives effective implementation, and these are engage, unite and reflect. These behaviours get to the heart of what drives effective implementation and should permeate all implementation strategies and actions. While the terms engage and reflect and unite may be familiar to schools, they mean something specific in the context of implementation. If we look more closely at engage to start with, so this is about the way in which people are involved in implementation, and the quality of this interaction really matters. There are 3 dimensions to effective engagement with implementation. Number 1, we want to engage people so they have the potential to influence change. That's about providing opportunities for people to share their perspectives, their ideas, their concerns. And this engage principle extends to students and families, as well as teachers and leaders. We want to engage people in collaborative processes, so creating ways for people to work together, to share ideas and insights, to solve problems. Structures like implementation teams can be really useful in this respect, and you may be familiar with implementation teams from the previous guidance. When a school community feels included in decisions that affect them, then implementation is likely to improve. People ultimately value what they feel part of. And we want to engage people through clear communication and active guidance. Whilst we want these ways of engaging people to be participatory and collaborative, it also needs to effectively guide and steer. This involves leaders communicating the direction of travel, explaining decisions, corralling efforts, and being really clear about keeping implementation on track. So there's that fine balance between leadership and the social and collaborative process. The next cross-cutting behaviour is unite, and as the guidance says, poor implementation can often be traced to differing values, understanding and practices among staff. This ambiguity means colleagues can appear as though they are not on the same page, or appear that they are on the same page when they are not. Actions that align and unite people are therefore a key driver of effective implementation. And there are a range of things to unite around, overarching visions and values, to the specific activities and practices that result from implementing a new approach. So we want to think about how we unite values, and if an approach doesn't align with people's values, then they're less likely to implement it. Being clear of exploring common goals, acknowledging and addressing concerns, discussing risks and benefits of taking action, implementation leaders can help unite values and improve buy-in. We want to unite knowledge and understanding. And whilst these shared values lay the foundation for successful implementation, schools also need to cohere around what those values and principles look like in practice. So this means moving beyond that shared vision and starting to develop a shared understanding of what is being implemented, how it will be implemented, and why it matters. We need to unite skills and techniques. So being clear about how we unite within implementation also includes uniting the skills and practical techniques that relate to a new approach, and that might be through ongoing professional development. And finally, we need to unite around the implementation process. And this extends to the values and practices that relate to the process of implementation itself. For example, developing a shared belief that monitoring implementation is key to enabling ongoing improvement rather than playing a punitive accountability can fundamentally change how staff feel about implementation. Leaders and staff should explicitly discuss how implementation is conducted in the school and how it can be improved. That clarity around the implementation process and the reason for such activities can help to unite. We know that building that shared understanding can be hard. This tweet discussing implementing a new curriculum in schools in New York shows the challenge schools and system leaders face in getting on the same page when implementing. Strategies like implementation planning can be really useful in building shared understanding and around the what and the why and the how, but only if people are actively engaged and involved. Planning in isolation won't unite understanding. The process here is more important than the output. And the final cross-cutting behaviour that is suggested is around reflect. A theme across the guidance report is that evidence and data should inform all aspects of implementation, both what to implement and how. Reflection underpins evidence-informed decision-making within implementation. It enables ongoing learning and improvement. If schools are implementing effectively, they will be reflecting on a range of things in an ongoing way. Pupil needs, current practices, fit and feasibility of possible new approaches, implementation problems and successes. To reflect effectively requires structures and processes at an organisational level. For example, how to monitor implementation, as well as individuals having a reflective outlook where they review and refine their own practice. So I'm just going to give you a moment now to have a look at a case study and to think about which behaviour aligns with the example that you are given. So if I just give you, if you want to pause the webinar now, just read through this case study and then decide which of those behaviours fits into each space. Is it an example of engage, of unite or reflect? So pause the webinar now and do that activity. Hopefully these were the answers that you arrived at. So the first one is an example of unite. The second is an example of reflect. And the third is an example of engage. Hopefully you can see through this activity an example of what that might look like in practice. Okay, moving on to recommendation 2. This outlines the contextual factors that influence implementation. So by contextual factors, we mean the behaviours that underpin effective implementation are influenced by the context in which implementation happens. These contextual factors can either be enabling or constraining. For example, it's hard to unite understanding through implementation planning if there isn't time to meet and discuss plans. Or reflecting on implementation progress is tricky if there isn't a system in place to monitor implementation. The guidance outlines 3 contextual factors that influence implementation. What is being implemented, systems and structures, and people who enable change. So if we just have a look at these one at a time. Starting with systems and structures, as the guidance says, it is all too easy to dream big when thinking about implementing a new programme or practice, but overlook the structural conditions that make that possible. Systems and structures here refers to the infrastructure that is needed to support implementation. Allow people to enact the behaviours that drive implementation, and that might mean providing time, considering roles, thinking logistically. Here are some examples of the things that you might need to consider when thinking about systems and structures. And it's important that we consider how we might repurpose existing systems and structures rather than bolting on new ones. Some structural factors are less controllable than others, yet can still influence implementation, for example, national or regional policies. The second contextual factor is whether there is a range of people who can lead and support the changes. This includes implementation leaders, school leaders, subject leads, but should be broader than that. People who enable change can be implementation teams, champions, early adopters, student representatives, support staff, among others. Distributing leadership and support has a number of advantages. Shares the burden of managing change, brings in different perspectives and expertise, and builds resilience as implementation becomes less reliant on specific individuals. The factors that influence whether an individual or group can support implementation include whether they have the knowledge and skills and expertise to help implement the approach. Do they feel empowered to act, and can they empower others? And have they the agency, the choice over the actions within their remit? School and implementation leaders should actively consider whether enough skilled and empowered people are available who can support implementation. It's important that this is considered before adopting a new approach. And the final contextual factor is slightly different in that it is the approach itself that is being implemented. But if you think about it, that makes sense, as the features of an intervention impact on how it will be implemented. For example, a complex whole school intervention with multiple elements and lots of people is likely to be harder to implement than a simple one-to-one reading intervention. Equally, if an approach is well specified, it will be easier to unite understanding and practices than if it is vaguely defined. It also influences the systems and structures that are needed and people who enable change. Schools therefore need to consider the features and requirements of what is being implemented and then design implementation accordingly. It should be looking for approaches that are evidence informed, right for the setting and feasible to implement. A process for selecting appropriate evidence informed approaches is provided in the Explore section. So again, we'll consider these contextual factors in relation to a case study, and we'll return to the case study of Pippa. I'll put the case study up on the screen in a moment, and we want you to consider what is being implemented, systems and structures, and people who enable change. So if you pause the webinar now, you'll be able to read that case study and see where the contextual factors fit to each of the examples. Okay, so hopefully these were the answers that you arrived at. And again, you can see with this case study the specific examples of these contextual factors in practice. So on their own, these factors can be hard to enact, and so we do need that structured process. And this is very familiar if you're familiar with the previous guidance. So you'll see those 4 phases of that process: explore, prepare, deliver, and sustain. Recommendation 3 looks at how we can adopt this structured process whilst being flexible at the same time. So the key message here is that the guidance retains the phased process, but it is more flexible and responsive to the individual setting and needs. So here we see it as a scaffold rather than a step-by-step sequence. This updated graphic is meant to convey the idea that the process is familiar with the 4 phases, but it is different as well. If we take the explore phase as an example of that, the previous version of the guidance perhaps gave the impression that the explore phase was quite linear and step by step. The new explore phase emphasises flexibility and a more dynamic conversation between considering people needs, the school setting and the evidence. It's not a step-by-step process. It provides manageable engagement with complexity. So now the new explore phase is centred around 2 questions. The first is the approach we are considering right for our setting? To answer that question, we firstly need to know the pupil needs and their root causes. As previously, this involves looking at a range of data sources and acknowledging their relative strengths and weaknesses. You may be familiar with this gathering and interpreting data guidance. Again, this can be found in the additional resources. But it also involves looking at what's already going on in relation to those needs. For example, if we've identified a problem with reading, we should also look at what's already going on in terms of reading. Are there existing approaches already in place? How are teachers routinely dealing with reading? At the same time, we should also be engaging with evidence that is relevant to our pupil needs. This will involve looking at sources such as the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, guidance reports, and so on. The recently published Using Research Evidence Guide is helpful here. Considering the evidence helps us determine what needs to change and whether a new approach is likely to meet our pupils' needs and be better than what's already going on. This tool is the Explore phase. As you can see, it's about matching an evidence-informed approach to our pupil needs and settings. Again, this is about structuring a manageable engagement with complexity. We move on to the prepare stage. The prepare phase is divided into two overarching implementation strategies: plan and design and practically prepare. Plan and design includes a thorough walkthrough of implementation planning and how to do it well, which, as mentioned previously, means engaging people and seeing planning as an opportunity to unite people around the changes. Note here that we've changed the term active ingredients to the more intuitive core components. The meaning is the same. Designing a monitoring system includes the importance of uniting people around why monitoring is happening, for example, driving improvement and unearthing potential barriers. The guidance also unpacks implementation outcomes in more detail and stresses the importance of monitoring and ensuring a range of implementation outcomes. Practically prepare includes selecting implementation strategies. There's a greater emphasis on selecting implementation strategies in response to needs and setting. One such strategy is professional development. There's a link to the professional development guidance and its role in uniting people around the core components of the approach. This isn't just about training and hoping for the best. This is about making sure that people are in the best position to enact the selected approach. Developing systems and structures that will be required to support the changes is also important, as is the importance of ongoing leadership communication, the directive and guiding part of Engage. As we move into the deliver phase, as the image on the right suggests, the deliver phase is framed as a learning process. In curling, you don't just launch the stone, close your eyes and hope for the best. You keep your eyes on it and make deliberate attempts to correct its course and speed. You monitor, you improve and learn from the experience. Deliver is divided into two overarching implementation strategies: support and encourage. For this, the role of leaders in supporting staff during initial attempts at implementation, making sure we engage people in decision making, giving teachers time to collaborate, plan and learn together, focusing on realistic goals. In this phase, leaders will provide prompts and reminders to help people feel connected to the approach and drive fidelity. And it's also important to reinforce professional development with follow-on support. Ongoing professional development and support that responds to needs is crucial here. For monitoring and improving, this is fundamentally about the reflect behaviours, but note that this also requires engaging people in the first place. Using monitoring data to improve implementation, think of the curling analogy, gathering in feedback from staff, pupils and parents to reflect, creates opportunities to address concerns, unite values around the changes and drive improvement. Tailoring implementation strategies in response to emerging barriers and enablers, again, reflecting. This is an example of how we encourage schools to take a more flexible approach to the implementation process. Finally, sustain. Sustain is divided into two: maintain the effort and review and act. To maintain the effort, we remind schools that the seeds of sustainability are sown throughout the implementation process. This means ensuring that when we use implementation strategies, they include the behaviours and contextual factors. We recommend revisiting implementation plans, refreshing professional development, and ensuring that improved outcomes are made visible to staff. Review and Act offers a more structured decision-making process than the previous guidance. The guidance walks schools through how to conduct a thorough review of implementation, for example, by reassessing pupil needs and implementation readiness, and outlines some next steps. Sustaining the approach by embedding it in the school's systems and structures, scaling up or down the approach, which will require a reassessment of new potential barriers, or de-implementing the approach altogether, for example, if we feel it has served its purpose. So those are the 4 phases of the process. As we've talked about, you'll have noticed that we refer back to behaviours and contextual factors throughout. They're all so closely intertwined, you can't really see them as a separate process. So this process helps schools do implementation and do it well. The cross-cutting behaviours and contextual factors help them to do it well. On the left here, you can see the 3 headline recommendations. So to summarise, we've gone from 6 recommendations to 3. Recommendations 1, 3, 4, 5 and 6 from the previous guidance are now wrapped up in one long recommendation, and that's recommendation 3. The behaviours and contextual factors each form a new recommendation. If you're familiar with the old guidance, you may be wondering where the focus on implementation climate has gone, because this was there was a specific recommendation about implementation climate in recommendation 2. Implementation climate refers to how staff feel about implementation, whether they feel the use of evidence-informed approaches is expected, supported and rewarded. Implementation climate builds or erodes over time in response to day-to-day activities and experiences. When schools attend to the behaviours and contextual factors and staff see positive outcomes, then the overall climate is likely to improve. This in turn builds further goodwill, which increases the chances of being able to implement approaches successfully in the future. Beware, the opposite scenario is also true. In its simplest terms, this means doing a good job of implementing something useful, out of which a more positive climate is likely to develop. So here, implementation climate is now woven through this guidance report, rather than being added on as a separate recommendation. Again, in summary, what we know from this updated guidance is that we are now looking at how to do implementation well, and it's a conversation around quality. One of the subplots throughout this narrative is the social nature of implementation, but it will be supported by systems and structures. We know that implementation is a process of ongoing inquiry, that reflection and monitoring is crucial throughout. And there's a real emphasis on evidence-informed implementation, evidence-informed decision-making on what to implement, but also how to implement. So what are we looking for overall? A nice metaphor is that of a jazz band. A group of people working together to create something that is greater than the sum of their individual efforts. United in terms of what they are looking to achieve, actively engaged, reflecting and adapting in a dynamic way. We've got people confident in their individual roles and how they contribute to the overall endeavour. The right supports and structures are in place to enable them to play, underpinned by dynamic and trusted communication. It's hard work, but it's also rewarding. Thank you for taking the time to walk through the new guidance with me. If you would like any more information or if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. I hope to see you again soon.